Hello and welcome to, little stumbling on my words there. Welcome to week 4 in Introduction to Sociology. Two very important discussions to have. Today we're going to be looking at deviance and social control, and then we're going to be looking at the media. And these are very important topics today as we see challenges to the social norms that are going on right now, and we see issues with the media. So this is a great time to take that sociological view. This is a personal critical thinking opportunity for you. This is the opportunity for you to really examine your own sociological imagination about how these things are happening in our world, and to be really intelligent and critical about how we process information. So we'll be getting a little bit into that in the chapters for this week. So when we look at Brightspace, we'll see that here we are in week 4, and we just got done socialization, groups and organization, and the sources of information special assignment. And here we are in week 4 looking at chapter 7, deviance, crime, and social control, a couple discussions and a quiz, and then media and technology, a discussion and the quiz. So let me transition to the course book and I can quickly go through that content. So chapter 7 is deviance, crime, and social control. And by way of introduction, here's a little movie on perspectives on deviance. And this is in terms of what brings about our desire to act outside the norms of our particular group. And that's what we kind of have to keep in mind, that deviance is relative to the norms, values, and expectations or culture of a particular group. So within, let's say, a family, there may be norms, values, and expectations that allow for, let's say, curse words to be used in casual confirmation, like please pass the effing salt, or something like that. Just sort of, there's a family that has that as a norm. There might be another family that is more strict about the use of those kinds of words, particularly in casual conversation, and may not allow that. So that same behavior may be deviant in one group and perfectly acceptable in another. Now that's at that micro level. We also have various levels of society. Every time we expand concentrically away from ourselves and we look at increasingly complex parts of our world and the different groups that we belong to, each one of those groups has not only its definition of norm, but its definition of abnormal or deviance. And the social control mechanism that we're talking about is every group, as a part of its ability to sustain and maintain its culture, has a process by which they seek to control its members and bring them into line with the expectations of that group. And so that's kind of like the big picture that we're looking at in this chapter, and it's scalable from everything, do you put your elbows on the table at home, to what is the most appropriate punishment for someone who's murdered somebody else. So it's the same process, the same ideas, but just different mechanisms by which those are carried out. So in the course book, we have those perspectives. We go into what is deviance, and really focusing on the idea that deviance is a moving away from the norms relative to a specific group. And here we have the Sopranos, a whole family of deviants here. Deviance can be positive. Being abnormal can be positive. Certainly when we look at revolutions around the world, the civil rights movement, components of Black Lives Matter, certainly not the violence pieces that have erupted on the fringes of that, but the actual movement of Black Lives Matter. These are ways in which people are acting that are bringing to light the issues that are going on and revealing those things to individuals who may be distant from those. And so sometimes acting abnormally is kind of what drives that process. And certainly from a sociological perspective, although I'm not in favor of violence and destruction as a part of protesting, but sometimes the individuals who have been trying to have their voice heard for so long build up quite a bit of anger when that voice continues to be ignored. And just like a small child whose needs get ignored for a while, they can get increasingly and increasingly loud. And so that would be the kind of, and I know that that's simplistic, but certainly that's one way to understand how people react when they're trying to get a message across to those in power. And that's part of what we're seeing in our country and around the world today. So we continue to make our way here. Social control is the mechanism inside of every group that brings us in line to what it is that we should be doing. Now, sorry, let's kind of go way back. We have a culture of norms, values, and expectations, let's say in our family. We learn them in those institutions of family. We learn them through the process of socialization. And with that process of socialization, we learn how that group informs and enforces those norms. And that's the social control piece. Sounds ominous to talk about social control, but without guidelines and rules and whatnot, we might not have morality is a set of rules that manages our behavior that runs against our nature. And so these are the rules and regulations from different groups that we have. So our family has them. If you're part of a gang, they have them. I have these things in the course book here. Part of a church, they have their norms, and they have kind of bringing people back into the fold, kind of thing. And when we're part of an organization that we have chosen to be part of, we are actually sort of buying into that control mechanism. So we're basically saying, I'm joining this group because I want you to tell me what to do. I believe in wanting to make these changes. So let's just say within a church organization, as I'm a Christian and I go to a Christian church, and while I don't totally agree, and I guess you can't really be part of a group that's there, I generally go there to try and be a better person, and I accept critique of my behavior because I signed up for it. So when we talk about when we belong to groups, whether it be a yoga group or a diet group, or these are groups that we join for the express purpose of them helping us guide our own lives. This is a willful process. If that's not what you want, it's not your group. You move along. Now, so each of us belongs to numerous groups, and based on our status within that group, we are subject to the rules and social control mechanisms of that group. When you put your elbows on the table, and that happens to be a violation of the norm and what we call folk ways of that family, so it might have been pointed out, there might have been a consequence the third time you did it or something, or maybe you got a strict talking to, and the talking to is supposed to be unpleasant, and it will make you not do that again. These kinds of things, those are all social controls. Meanwhile, we have a representative in the U.S., we have a representative government that creates rules and regulations called the law. These are norms, values, and expectations of person's behavior that are considered legal or within the bounds of accepted behavior within that larger societal group, per se. And when we violate those things, we learn about driving. Let's say we took driver's ed, and we learn that those signs that are on the side of the road indicate to us the limits of our speed. So we learn that association. Our elected officials chose to put 70 on the highway and 55 and then 20 in a residential area. They chose to put those speed limits for safety reasons. And when we engage in deviance and I drive 80 on the highway, or I drive 65 in the back roads, or I drive 30 right through town, I am being deviant. Now, the social control mechanism that's in place for that is we have individuals in special cars with special uniforms indicating special status, and part of their status is the role, part of their job title is the role to enforce social norms. So they have the authority, the legitimate authority. We haven't talked about power yet, but we'll talk about legitimate and illegitimate power. But they have the legitimate power from those same laws that created the speeding sign to begin with, to be able to restrict your actions, basically pull you over. You're supposed to respond to those lights, pull you over, inform you that you are now violating the norm, and potentially either leave it as a warning or issue you a summons to the court to eventually face punishment for violating those rules, in an effort from society to say, if we punish you a little bit for doing this, then maybe you'll stop. There's a big behavior plan going on. You get punishment for certain things, and just like putting your hand on a hot stove, you're supposed to learn to not put your hand on the hot stove. And to whatever degree, and it's certainly a good argument to talk about how effective these laws are in terms of controlling deviance, but that's the point. That's the whole point of law enforcement, the criminal justice system. All of that is all collectively, essentially, a social control mechanism for a large society like ours. Now, we also have in our utility belts of action, we have civil disobedience. And this is when a group of people choose to break the laws in protest to either a separate issue or to protest the actual laws themselves. So let's say there's a I'm going to make this up, but you have a piece of property that is owned by the government, but it's a pristine, natural place, and there's a plan to build a pipeline or something on it. And people go to that place and they stand on the ground and they refuse to leave, and they get the news media involved to get their voice heard, to change the current status of that property, which is written in the law, or written in statute, or written in our economic exchange process. This land, might be private ownership, or it could be government land, and they want to do, people can do whatever they want with their land, but then some people can come onto that property and protest and say that's not what we want to see. So they're breaking the law, but we have some tolerance for that. And it's probably, as bizarre as our society, sometimes frustrating as our system can be, we are incredibly fortunate that we have the ability to engage in civil disobedience, and for the most part, in some ways, get away with it. And so, because the law and law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and certainly as we look at the media, has a perspective of civil disobedience, as, like it or not, it reveals frustration with the current system, and it is a tool of communication. And so we want to be able to limit that. Nobody wants to get harmed, and we certainly don't want property damaged or anything like that. And that's a different thing. That's not within the tolerance, or shouldn't be within the tolerance. But we're okay with people, standing where they don't belong and shouting. We're a country that embraces that, and I think it's important that we keep that ability to express yourself, enshrined in our free speech Bill of Rights, is vitally important, even if we don't like what's being said, because that law protects everybody, even though it might be uncomfortable, even though it might be offensive. And of course, there's limits on that. When you're calling people to action on hate crimes, that's not free speech, that's incitement. And when you're, but if you're spouting your religious views or talking about how you feel about things, uncomfortable or not, those are enshrined in our rights. And we want to make sure our country has a wide tolerance in that, in terms of people's behavior. So here we have, civil disobedience here, this area where we look at, what is the role of civil disobedience in moving societies and changing norms, values, and expectations. Different stuff here about mob mentality, social identity, things that bring groups of people together. It's kind of what, when we talked about groups, we talked about aggregates. Most mobs are an aggregate, but then they establish through their activities and through a united goal, they establish a mob mentality, and they start acting in coordination. And it seems like this big coordinated event, and some of it might be, but a lot of it is really the evolution of aggregate mobility. When a bunch of people start doing something, when we see the stuff going on in the streets and breaking windows and stuff like that, there's a psychology that's happening at that time in terms of attaining a sense of identity and connection with those who are doing that, which sort of deteriorates your personal restrictions on behavior and opens the doors to allow that. Doesn't restrict personal responsibility. Not at all. But the process by which a typically law-abiding individual is suddenly throwing a brick through a window happens for a reason. And it's important to understand those reasons. Oftentimes, the core of that reason is extremely legitimate. Yet, the behavior of the crowd moves it in a way that maybe loses sense of the legitimacy of that original grievance. And that's kind of what we're seeing on the streets when we see Black Lives Matter, and certainly it was what we saw with the Capitol riots. It's individuals that, a mix of individuals, some were there to do harm and damage, and others were not, but certainly the size of that group expanded as individuals' personal restraints became eroded by the sense of identity that they felt with the other people there. It's really important to understand these processes that happen in real time. So more stuff about, different things about Black Lives Matter and a little bit about the criminal justice system. I kind of decided for this chapter to not spend a lot of time actually examining the criminal justice system. I think that that's something that would probably need to develop a course specifically for that, the complexities of that. But certainly understanding, what I want you to get is this sociological sense that the things that keep your elbows off the table are the same sorts of things that keep people from, or try to address the issue of people murdering each other. It is all different scales of social control. We experience those every day. We buy into them. We buy into them like we buy into the Constitution when we register to vote. We buy into the rules of a club when we sign the membership form, and we buy into living in our like say, for example, some of you might be adults living at home, and because you make that choice, and it might be a choice without a whole lot of very pleasant alternatives, but you make that choice, you're making a choice to continue to live under a set of rules that you are not necessarily in charge of. So there's that kind of balance between maintaining the peace but recognizing as an adult you would like to make these decisions on your own, but because you're choosing to live there, you're sort of, signing the contract that, like, while I'm here, I'm still going to operate under the house rules. So that brings us to our assessment area for Chapter 7, and we look at, I want you to do an experiment, and it has to be legal, and I don't want it to be related to coronavirus and the standards for distancing and masking. That's not an acceptable deviant behavior, but certainly I'd like you to engage in some sort of minor deviant behavior. It could be at home, could be you interrupt, or you ignore people, or you purposefully, don't do the dishes. It's any sort. It could be a small thing like that, and recognize the response from people. Like I've had individuals simply, let's say two partners come home from work and the regular ritual is for them to share, it's a good ritual, for them to share information about their day. And the student in my class decides to, during that period of time, they're just texting. They just take out their phone and they're texting when they're supposed to be engaged in this discussion. And it happens very quickly. The other person will go, "What are you doing?" And right there, you're seeing the initiation of a tiny little piece of social control. First, I recognize that you're not doing what we normally do. And there's this mutually shared expectation of that norm. So why aren't you doing what we normally do? There's a recognition of that. And then there's a questioning. If you're doing this, is something going on that needs to be addressed, or you're, whatever. Why are you doing this? And like, stop it. And then I want you to, you can then, quit acting and then ask the person what it was like for you to act abnormally. And it's interestingly how emotional these things go. It doesn't take long for your partner who you're ignoring to get pissed, to be straightforward about it. It's like, hey, we have an agreement here, and we see the strength of the norms, expectations, and values that we have in a couple, let's say, and how quickly we recognize when things are not going right, and how quickly we want to address it. And that's that social control mechanism within a. Now, there's always, and the inquiry, why are you doing this, is no different than the court system that asks a criminal, why did you do that? I want to know what your reasoning was. And just as if the person's texting, they can say they're texting and you say, why aren't we engaging in our normal process here? They might say, my brother was in an accident. Okay, the norms are off. That's a legitimate reason to deviate from our normal expectations for each other. And so that inquiry is almost like the court system going in, and let's evaluate why this is going on, and maybe there's a legitimate reason why this person is deviating from the norm. Now, our next discussion is to look at past social deviances. You look those up anywhere in the past, even the Bolshevik Revolution. I don't care which one you look at, and how successful were they? Were these large social deviances that were placed to bring about social change? And finally, we have a quiz about your own personal social group. And what I'm looking for in this is a detailed answer that identifies the group, identifies a norm within that group, identifies what you do to violate that norm, and then a detailed explanation as to what will happen if you do that. Let's say in your family, the norm is that you are all Democrats. And you can violate that by either getting into a discussion where you're in support of former President Trump's policies or something like that. And so that would be sort of a deviance from the normal kind of perspective that's accepted within the family. And what would happen, and not only what would happen in response to what you said, but what would happen, how would the family try to bring you back into line? That's the point. That's the social control. I don't only want to reject your ideas, I want you to abandon those ideas and come back into the family. And what is that process? So think deeply about that. It doesn't have to be that much of a contentious issue. It could be the elbows on the table for all we know. But it can be anything of a group that you belong to, a group of friends, your family, at work, whatever. You can look at those. But I want you to think through those steps. This is not if I stole paper at work, I'd get fired. That's not enough. I want you to go into, it's at work. This is the norm of the behavior. It could be a policy statement. Here's the, in fact, some workplaces have policy statements about what's going to happen if you violate those norms. You can actually go through that process and be detailed enough so that, like, I might get fired. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? And be describe it, well, I would do this and I would be brought in. If I stole paper from the office, I'd be brought into the office. I'd be, this is a violation number 1. If I did it again, that's violation number 2, and it's subject to maybe some consequences, including being fired, and just go into that detail. Put some time into the answer to this to really flesh out the kind of stuff that we're talking about in this particular chapter. Now, we head into another contentious issue in Chapter 8, and that's the media and technology. And one of the basic premises that I want to get into heading into this particular chapter is the media and, of course, technology involved in that, how we access information and stuff. Probably at no other time in history has it been more important to develop critical thinking skills to become a good consumer of media and technology. It's not the fault of the media. You got to understand that media produced today, because of the commercialization of news and the media and, opinionated, there are news agencies that are getting rid of reporting the news and just reporting pundit opinion, on either side. They're all over the place. And moving away from facts to then interpretation of facts. And we all know where that can lead. But the ultimate goal of the media is to sell you stuff. No matter what you're looking at, they're all commercial. Unless you can get something for free, it's, and even then you have to be very careful that you are understanding that the purpose of media is to sell you something. Therefore, you need to be a very, very skilled consumer of information that comes. It raises the bar in terms of our need to screen and look for the facts where they are. And there's a couple psychological processes that I'm going to get into that sort of get in the way of that. So there's some introduction stuff in the course book here, but getting right into content, let's look at first at the concept of technology. Now, technology in general is a society changer. This is actually a course I've actually thought of creating, the sociology of technology, because it's a force of change. Technology comes along and it changes the way we do things. It changes the norms, changes our expectations. And so right now, for example, under a coronavirus restrictions, without modern technology, without communication technology like we have right now, things would just simply close down. Schools would have just closed down. What has happened is, thanks to technology, other ways of getting the job done have actually been made. And that was the expectation going in. No one said, what are we going to do? People said, how are we going to harness technology to continue what we were doing? There was no throwing up the arms and saying, we're closed. There was, how are we going to do this and work our way around these restrictions? And that exemplifies the power of technology to change our actual expectations for how do we react to these kinds of things. So here we have technology playing a really, really important role in terms of shaping how we view and interact with the world. And we're faced again with the basic tenet of sociology. Not all technology is equal, and not everybody has access to that equal level of technology. And in this day right now, for let's say the schools going into remote learning, does everybody have good internet connection? Does everybody have a good device? Does everybody have people around them to help them problem solve when the teacher is at a distance? All of these things, these are creating barriers, or actually, they're not creating barriers, they're revealing barriers that have existed. Now that we're dependent on technology, the fact that we don't all have equal access to technology is in stark relief. It's being brought up and saying, oh, there's some inequality that maybe we assumed wasn't there, or maybe we knew it was there, but it wasn't an issue because we were still able to kind of cross that bridge when we were all in the same room. But now that we're depending on that stuff, it's revealing that inequality. Not everybody has access to the same kind of technology. So these are important questions going on right now in our current restrictions using technology. I'm sending this video out as I think an important part of teaching this class, yet there might be students in my class whose internet access makes watching a video like this very difficult because I might be they don't have a good enough connection and whatnot. And that's actually kind of creating a sense of inequality. So I temper the importance of this video and stick to the stuff that's in, for the most part, sticking to the stuff that's in the course book, not because I don't have more to say about any one of these things, but because that would create more of a barrier or create a difference of opportunity for those who could watch this video and gain everything they're going to gain from it, and those who don't have a connection to the internet that is able to sustain this kind of data. And so, okay, so back into the course book here. We have some movies here looking at net neutrality and what does that mean, things that we hear about in the news. Movie here about the moral operating system, an interesting perspective on that. And then we get into social media and the importance of social media of creating our sociological imagination. And this is a highly controversial thing because a lot of people, not everyone, but certainly a lot, millions of people, turn to social media as a means of constructing their sociological imagination and in very real sense of their social identity, their public persona being developed in social media. And then of course, just like education is now being done at a distance, this kind of interaction is happening as well. So the importance of social media has been brought to the front, and social media, the collective experience of social media, is having a much larger impact on our country than it has before. We're in an age when, and I'm true, my opinion of this is that social policy should not be discussed by any politician using social media. That is not a good place for that to happen. You should have formal channels of information that go out. They need to be vetted. People who wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go on Twitter, regardless of which side that's on, and post their ideas is a scary notion coming from the individuals that are in such powerful positions. They should not be doing that, in my opinion. Not a rights restriction, it's a moral restriction. Not that you'd say you can't, it's like you shouldn't. You really shouldn't put this raw stuff out there. And so, but it's happening and people are using Twitter and they're using Facebook to try and move groups in there. And these become unreliable sources of information. Intense emotions, unvetted, unthought about it. It's as if you went into Brightspace and I hope that you read the discussions, and maybe this has happened, you read a question, you read a discussion, and immediately your response is, oh, this is BS, I don't mean Brightspace. This is, I think this is crap, whatever you're doing. But you don't post that, do you? Hope not. You think about what it is, you think about what, I'm communicating, I'm participating in this class. I don't want to make anybody feel any undue discomfort. I'm trying to meet the criteria of the expectations of my teacher and whatnot. And you go through a well thought out process of creating your answers for questions. This does not happen as frequently as it probably should in social media. Now, let's look at media itself. And one of the areas that I look at, if you look over here on the right, I look at the perspectives on technology and media, and the functional perspective being it is a commercial function. Commercial is what .com stands for. When they created the web, different from the internet, but when we created the World Wide Web, and we had those 3 letters at the end, they can be org, they can be GOV, they could be com for commercial. Now there's TV. There's all kinds of ones now. Net. And that each one of them have original meanings, meaning that they are commercial websites. These are different than other types of websites, which might be subject to different rules or different expectations for those things. So .com means they're trying to sell something, almost always. So KVCC is not KVCC.com. Although we're trying to sell something, we're trying to sell classes and degrees, but that commercial part of it, and that should always be on our mind when we're consuming this media, is that it has that commercial function, entertainment function. It helps to define social norms, and it's unrestricted that way. So again, we have to be vetting this stuff to make sure that we're taking it in the way we want. It can change our lives. I mean, social media has been used to create lots of communication. Social media has been used for people to experiment with alternative identities. There's a whole field of psychotherapy having to do with creating the person you want to be in the social media world, hoping that those skills and risk-taking will translate into your real world, but doing it in the social media world is a little bit distanced, under supervision, of course. The conflict kind of stuff is who's controlling the message, and it's usually the product developer. The advertising really is controlling the mechanism because they're targeting products to individuals. So if you want to sell your product, you look at what you're selling, whatever it is, and you see that there's a demographic of white conservatives that are not buying your product, and they break it down that way. And you want that group, you want to bolster your sales in that group. You will choose channels in media that attract or have a history and a proof and data that they have attracted this particular demographic, and you will advertise on those channels because that's the group. You don't really care about the politics, you don't care about the opinions. All I care about is that group of individuals or that category of people is not buying enough of my products, and I want to boost sales. So those channels, those advertisers support those channels. And those channels are working for the advertisers, so they have to make sure that they continue and tailor their content to the audience that is being identified by the people who pay the bills. Very important to keep that mechanism in mind. Behind the scenes, it's not as nefarious as we think. It's really, you have a media outlet that attracts a demographic, and they sell that ability to attract that demographic to advertisers who want to sell to that demographic. And so we have that. There's, of course, technology in terms of surveillance. There's issues about, that have been revealed about that our cell phones track us all the time, that we are carrying around this object that really allows people to know where we are and what we do when we leave digital footprints wherever we go. And a lot of our life is exposed to big data because it's being gathered by these devices. And the portrayal of gender in the media. And this, I kind of look at it broad. There's, of course, the opportunity for media to expand that definition of gender. But then let's say we look at shoot 'em up video games, and if you look at the stylizing of how women and men are drawn in those, it's pretty dichotomous. And the portrayal of women in the media continues to be an issue in many, many different respects. It is a method by which we construct reality. So again, if you're going to use Lego pieces to build your world, use good quality Lego pieces. You want them to last, you want them to be worthy, you want them to be truthful. So we always have to be on the watch for that. And social networking, connecting with others, again, we see that sort of that meaning that comes from that. The postmodern perspective is, of course, in this day and age, social media is incredibly important as we connect with others, just in the symbolic interactionist perspective. We're connecting with others, sharing information. We buy all our stuff, buy a lot of our stuff through these channels now. And it's how we are defining new and interrelated social groups that do not have the usual. When we talked about groups, we talked about them interacting frequently, and prior to the advent of social media, that interaction was usually face-to-face. That put geographic limitations on groups. Those geographic limitations no longer exist if you're using social media to define that group. So I can belong to a group. They can be very close, very meaningful. I'm connected to them. Maybe they're my most important group. Maybe they're a primary group, and they're people all over the world belong to that group. And so that's a very, very fundamentally different way in which we construct our reality via social media. Now I go into, what does the media really do? What do you trust? Where does this information come from? And we enter into some of the psychology associated with why we tend to see this sort of division that's happening. Now keep in mind that you attract attention. You got these media companies that attract particular demographics that their advertisers want to advertise to. So some kind of go down the middle in terms of, controversy. Some lean to the left, some lean to the right, some are extreme left, some are extreme right, going after different demographics. The individuals on the screen wholeheartedly believe in what they're doing and that they're educating and they're, but to a degree, they're only doing it just like I am expressing my stuff here. There's a paycheck at the end of this. And so there's, it's certainly not the only reason I do what I do, and I don't think it's the only reason any of those people on those media channels do it, but that's always a part of it. Now, we know that if we want to attract somebody's attention, it has to be kind of big and loud. So we can take news bites and expand them into, big issues. And so I'll take, for example, I just recently had a Facebook conversation with an old high school buddy of mine, and we were talking about, he's conservative and I'm liberal, and so it's always fun having a conversation like this. And he was talking about our current president, Joe Biden's canceling of the Keystone Pipeline, and how did this affect the economy. And he was saying, the president came and he's like destroying the economy and he's, doing this kind of stuff. And I said, okay, I understand. And I want to say this, and as I did when I was responding to him in Facebook, that I don't want to in any way diminish the pain associated with people losing their jobs, because people lost their jobs because of that. I also don't want to get into the discussion about why he did that, what the land issues or the conservation issues, the controversy of that particular thing, or what the ultimate economic impact would have been worth it or not. The argument I made in that particular discussion was the canceling of that pipeline was not a big part of our economy, statistically. Again, with all due respect for people who lose their jobs. But looking at it, is he wrecking our economy? Now, I did the math, and based on our total gross domestic product, the actual cost of the pipeline, all of its initial cost. That doesn't mean not the fallout of all that stuff when it would finally get going, but the initial cost of that was $5.2 billion. And that's a lot of money. But it pales in comparison to the $24.24 trillion gross domestic product of the United States. If you made $50,000 a year and you were the U.S. economy and we scaled it down, the cost of the entire project for Keystone is $12 to your $50,000 a year. So it's a $12 change in your personal economy, making $50,000 a year. So relatively speaking, it's a really small part. Big part for those who lost their jobs. Got that. But not a raging change to our economy. Certainly displays a different philosophy about what the president's role is, but the president's role is relatively minimal. My point is that individuals who may be against the president or for the president might take those issues, and they're real, but expand them into general statements like he's ruining the government. Now, what that represents in terms of the psychology of how we process information is two things. There's negativity bias. These are real constructs studied by psychologists. Negativity bias and availability heuristics. Now, negativity bias, for one, we're attracted to bad news. This is human nature. We've studied it for a long time. Bad news gets our attention, things that are going awry. So if you want to focus the attention of a certain group of people, point out the bad thing that's going on. Not the good things. There could be a million good things going on, but the attention grabber will be the bad thing. And we have a bias toward that. Same as if you think about a person that you were dating and you broke up with, and it was a nasty breakup, you can think back and just list off all the bad things, all the things you should have seen, all these things. It's a little harder maybe to remember that there actually were some good times for the time you were with them, but they get overshadowed because we have a bias toward negativity. Now, the availability heuristics is the role that the media plays to take this negative bias and make it very big on our screen. To take the negative element and make it very big. And that we are all subject to this. I'm not saying that I'm free of this bias at all. And we look and we favor negativity, and then in our, let's say, cognitive laziness, we pick the things that are big. Those are the things that attract our attention. It's kind of basic psychology. The need to delve deeper and look behind the news and look at multiple sources is hard to accomplish because it's time consuming. For one thing, as a more responsible consumer of the media and the news, it takes more effort now in this world to dissect this stuff and try to see things from different angles. In fact, it's sometimes hard to find those different angles. They are there, and the simplistic ideas that are being promoted really big, I believe, are largely misleading because reality is more complex than that. You can think about any sort of situation in your life where something went wrong. And the devil's in the details, right? Things went wrong because lots of little things happened, or people's motivations are complex. It's not when we're looking at availability heuristics, we want the quick and dirty answer. We want you to know this is what needs to happen. It's simplistic. It's the sales pitch. It's the my ideas will solve all these problems kind of thing. And simple ideas do not completely address complex problems. Okay. So another example I had with this and is that that Biden just recently signed an executive order or a law that said that high school sports, that people who are trans women can participate in women's sports. Or that it was actually a law that eliminated participation in anything, an anti-discrimination law. Awesome. Perfect. But there are some outcomes in terms of women's sports that the people in women's sports are talking about. So here's this, what is a very valid and very good point in terms of anti-discrimination, but there might be some consequences for that we need to talk about and realize and possibly discuss in terms of how sports operate at the high school level all the way to the elite status. So these are controversial issues that I've read about, and these voices sometimes don't make it to the front because the big, loud issues are being promoted out there right in the front, and it takes a little bit of effort to get behind that news. Okay, I introduce in this chapter a book that I really like, is what I read this last summer, Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now. I really encourage you to get that, because what it does is it looks at those bigger picture things that are going on in the world using data and it provides a counter argument for sounding like, the world's going to hell in a handbasket sort of perspective that attracts our attention on the news. And in fact, the world is not going to hell in a handbasket. It is actually, in many, many respects, gradually getting better. And so it's a very interesting attack on that heuristics that we have of interpreting the world. So I really, really encourage you to go out and get that book. Okay, that brings us to the end of the chapter. Here we have, I want you in the discussion, we talk about bias, and consider how the constructs of negativity bias and availability heuristics may be influencing your perspective of the world. The media is selective. It's not fake news, it's selective news. They select what they portray, and sometimes it's outright lies, obviously, and how do these natural tendencies that we have of negativity bias and heuristics play in how we interpret the world? And then in the quiz, what's technological inequality? You can look that up and reflect on the positive and negative effects of technology here. How has the cell phone made things better and worse, for example, but choose any sort of technology on that. So that's our journey for this week, and I hope to see you actively in those discussion boards, and have a great week.